Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Rachel Rosen. I'm the Communications Director for Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our entire staff, our President and CEO, Mark Melman, our board co-chairs, Todd Richmond and Ann Lewis, I know they're on today. We're so happy to have you here, especially during this particularly difficult time. We're thinking of you and our community and our loved ones. We hope you stay well. I'm going to hand it over to Mark in just a minute, but I wanted to go over a couple of items first. If you would like to submit questions today, I know we have folks joining us both on Facebook and through Zoom. If you're on Zoom, you can submit questions through the Q&A tab on your Zoom account. And if you're on Facebook, you can submit a comment through the live comments feature. We will get to as many questions as we can. Also, I believe that our social media information is up now. If you like what you hear today and you're interested in learning more about us, please do give us a like on Facebook. Please follow us. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram. You can sign up for our updates on our website, and that's at dmfi.org. Again, thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Melman.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Thank all of you for being with us. Excuse me. On behalf of DMFI, I want to apologize first for the angle at which I'm being viewed. This is a well-known flaw of Dell laptops, but unfortunately, we can't really fix it during this COVID period, so forgive me for that. But I'm delighted everyone's here. I want to wish everyone a Chag Sameach, a happy Israel Independence Day. We are very grateful that David Horovitz is with us. He is one of the most acute, careful, and insightful observers of the Israeli scene and commentators on the Israeli scene. He is the editor-in-chief of the Times of Israel. And as I've said to him before, Times of Israel is one of the most accurate as well as excellent media outlets in Israel, as far as I'm concerned. They adhere to real journalistic standards, which is not true of the entire Israeli media, I'm sorry to say. But it is an outstanding publication, Times of Israel, and it is has over 7 million monthly users. David, before joining the Times of Israel, was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He has authored several books, Still Life with Bombers, Israel in the Age of Terrorism, and also A Little Too Close to God, The Thrills and Panic of a Life in Israel. He is obviously a regular writer, regular commentator at the Times of Israel website. We're so grateful that you're here, and we look forward to hearing from you about Israel on its 72nd birthday. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Pleasure to do this, and I'll give you a sort of a little overview of how things are at the moment, and then hand this back to you and lead this wherever you want to take it, okay? So I'm speaking to you at, I guess, a little after 7 o'clock Israel time. It's the tail end of Independence Day, of Yom HaAtzmaut, which ordinarily is a day of people out and about, barbecuing, Air Force fly pasts, basically Israelis cooking meat on every available patch of green in the country. That's what I would say. And today we're locked down. We're not in the sort of slightly loosened regulations of the last few days and weeks, where part of the workforce has been allowed to go back to work. There have been some pretty stringent restrictions. They've been loosened a little, but for the last day or so, we've been locked down in the way that we were on the first night of Pesach, on Seder night. The concern being that this very sociable and social nation tends to get together on Jewish festivals and national festivals, and therefore we've had two very surreal days here. This time of year is always very, very unique, somewhat surreal, in that we switch from Memorial Day for the soldiers and victims of terrorism to Independence Day. So from the depth of grief to profound celebration. That's always a very, very wrenching and dramatic couple of days. But this year, because of COVID-19, it's all taking place in this surreal atmosphere with radical restrictions. So the radical step yesterday of the government closing the military cemeteries, which you can imagine was an incredibly dramatic thing to do, to bar bereaved families from visiting the graves of their lost children, in many cases, lost in battle. The government of Israel banning them from uniting with, being at the gravesite of their lost loved ones because of concern that lots of people flock to the cemeteries. Unfortunately, there are lots of people. There was concern that this would lead to a new bout of contagion, and then this much deepened close down for Yom Ha'atzmaut, everybody at home. You can hear celebration taking place, but just to be very personal, my family, I have a big family in Israel, extended family, and every year we have dozens of cousins and extended family who converge for Yom Ha'atzmaut, and we didn't do it this year for the first time probably in 20 years, and it's pretty radical. The more, the broader context in which you find Israel is very affected by two things: by the battle against COVID-19 and by our politics. We can talk about that in some depth as this call goes on, but virus-wise, I do want to come back to this because I think it's very telling, and you'll all make your comparisons. Israel has a death toll of 200 in the virus, and that's astoundingly low. We can talk about why that is, and I think potentially it could have been immensely higher. The price of that has been an economy in meltdown, and this is a country that to some extent lives and dies on its economy. It needs to have a viable, strong, thriving economy, in part to ensure that we're able to fund our own defense. And unemployment went from less than 4% to over 25% in a matter of weeks because of the crackdown to try and stop the spread of the virus. So those, that's a huge thing. And the other element, of course, is we are now, last time I counted, 16 months into not having a fully functioning government after 3 elections. You may have heard that we have a new government. We don't. We have a coalition deal. It's being challenged in the High Court. It hasn't been finalized. The government has not been sworn in. They've got about 8 days to go. Even that's not necessarily a real deadline because they can claim that they've done the deal and put off elections a little bit longer. But in 2-3 weeks, if this deal isn't consummated, shall we say, if the government isn't thrown in, we will be on the road to 4th elections. Don't ask me now if I think that's going to happen, because I can't be sure of anything. The protagonists think it's not going to happen, that we will have a government. But until we actually have a government, we don't have a government. So a virus, a tanking economy, probably as a necessity to prevent the spread of the virus, a new government that we can talk about what it might do, but that doesn't quite exist yet, and therefore still the prospect of a slide towards yet a 4th election in the space of a year and a half. So that's my cheerful opening introduction. Now you take this away and steer me wherever you want it.
David, thanks so much. Before I start asking questions, I want to remind everyone, please submit questions for David through the Q&A feature on your Zoom account. And if you're on Facebook, you can submit it in the live comments section. David, you touched a little bit on the low fatality rate on COVID. So just quickly, I was hoping you could expand on that a little bit before we go on to talk about Israel's accomplishments. Okay, good. I just think it's really interesting. It's an incredibly low toll. I mean, wherever you are, you will know how to make comparisons. I grew up in Britain, as you may have gathered, and the British Jewish community is about 350,000 people. There are more than 300 Jewish people dead in Britain. Israel's a country going on 10 million people, and we have 202, 3. I didn't look in the last few hours, but just a little over 200. Not only that, we had a failure of communication, and I think that's really the most important way of stressing this to parts of the ultra-Orthodox community. There was some defiance and there is some extremism, but broadly speaking, there was a lack of awareness of how grave this threat was for longer than should have been the case. And therefore, in a city like Bnei Brak, 200,000 people, they didn't introduce social distancing as early as the rest of the country did, and it became an epicenter. Once the message got through, very, very widespread cooperation. The mayor of Bnei Brak, you should know, because it's hard to tell what's really going on. So the mayor of Bnei Brak on Erev Yom Ha'atzmaut, on the eve of Independence Day, issued a message of thanks to the army, basically, for helping them tackle the crisis, for bringing food to the city. Once they understood what was going on,
they followed the rules. That's not been the case everywhere in the ultra-Orthodox community, as I know it's not been the case in the ultra-Orthodox community all over other parts of the world as well. You know, there are extremist elements, but that has not been the norm here. And yet, despite the failure of communications and so on, still only 200 dead. And you make a comparison with a country like Sweden, which I think is possibly the other extreme, a bigger country, less dense parts of the population for sure, and a decision not to take some of the more drastic economic measures. And look at their numbers. I think they're over 20,000 now. Belgium, which is maybe 1 million more people than Israel, 7,000, and they did lock down pretty strictly. So, you know, I think Israelis feel we're paying a very, very heavy economic price, and that is not a marginal factor in terms of people's mental equilibrium, in terms of the economic impact, in terms of other medical procedures and disasters and emergencies that I think have been shunted aside. But especially around Memorial Day and around Independence Day, when you think that the most vulnerable Israelis were often the elderly pioneering Israelis, I think we can be very proud and appreciative of the broad priority, which was making sure we did pretty much everything within reason to try and keep everybody alive, with a great deal of collateral is the wrong word, but with a great deal of collateral cost.
Okay. David, we have a question from one of our board members, Mark Gerstein. He wishes you and your family well. And he asks, how's the COVID crisis affecting the security situation in Israel and the dynamics of the relationship with the PA and Hamas?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it kind of mirrors. I mean, this is my take, right? You're speaking to me, so there'll be other people who would answer lots of these questions differently. And, you know, I'm not, you know, I'm only one person's opinion. I would say it kind of mirrors the dual nature of some of these relationships. So, for example, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes with Hamas. Overtly, there have been some threats from Hamas leaders. If we have a pandemic here and you don't give us enough medical equipment, you know, we're going to make you pay, kind of thing. But apparently Hamas has been tackling this fairly sensibly. Their first cases were by definition not people who'd come into Gaza from Israel, but people who'd come, I think, from Pakistan, through Egypt into Gaza. They've not had very many cases. They seem to have isolated cases of contagion. I imagine that they are not particularly well equipped in terms of checking, in terms of medical services, but we're not aware at the moment of a crisis in Gaza, and we may be naive and we may not know. But I suspect that Hamas would make sure we were aware of it if there was a crisis there. With the PA, again, this dual nature, very, very good cooperation, as there is on security with the PA. A lot of medical cooperation, very, very serious efforts by the PA to isolate people who have been infected, a fair amount of checking. At the same time, some pretty nasty incitement against Israel via PA social media. The claim, by the way, a lot of the cases, as far as we understand, in the West Bank, maybe by definition, were infection of Palestinians who've been working in Israel and then went back. The PA has heightened its dissemination of allegations that not only that a lot of the cases that they had came from Israel, but in some cases that they were deliberately spread by Israel. So there's a lot of predictable nastiness at an overt level, and behind the scenes, quite good cooperation. You know, and that's, like I say, kind of typical of the relationships in so many aspects of the interaction.
Great, David. Let's talk about Israel's independence a bit. Can you give us, what do you think some of the biggest achievements and accomplishments have been over the past 72 years?
Yeah, well, we could talk of nothing else, right? Because there's a great deal to say, and you know, we could be very brief and say, well, you know, the greatest achievement of Israel is it's survived, and there's some truth in that. But it hasn't just survived; it's survived, I would say, against very, very heavy odds from the get-go, and it's thrived, and it's an exemplar of many wonderful positives. If I think about my family and the peer group of my kids, we are raising generations of self-sufficient, motivated, creative, fine young people. And that's been the case for a long time, which defies logic when you think of the education system. I don't know how my kids got, you know, fairly smart. I'm sure they learned some of it at school, but a lot of curiosity, a lot of intellectual curiosity, a lot of tech curiosity, like I say, innovation, stuff like that. in terms of some of the things that we've been able to pioneer in this country. This was a nation whose first major infrastructure project was building a water carrier from the Sea of Galilee, from Lake Kinneret to Beersheba. And water has been a big theme for Israel. And not only, I would say, I wouldn't go quite as far as say we beat the drought, but we can cope with the drought because we became very good at recycling and desalination. And one of the finest things we ever did in Israel was we taught a great deal of the rest of the world how to grow a lot with very little water through drip irrigation and so on. Real achievements. An economic powerhouse that thrives in the areas of tech and computer surgery and medical research. I don't know who's going to come up with the best treatments and the best vaccines for this virus, but I know that Israelis, as in all such areas of enterprise and innovation, are at the forefront. I've been in the last few weeks in the lab of an Israeli scientist at Hebrew U, who reckons maybe he's making some progress, who's been, as he very nicely put it, throwing chemicals at proteins. It's apparently not a particularly complicated virus, although it seems to be wreaking a great deal of havoc. But trying to find used drugs or approved drugs that can somehow interrupt and prevent the proteins in this virus, or one of them, from acting, and therefore disarm the virus. That's the kind of thing that Israel has done. So from a birth in the midst of a war that we had no logical right to survive, through the preemptive war of '67, and with the astonishing victory and the enduring complications and implications of that success, through the growth of the population, the ingathering of exiles, people who needed Israel as a refuge, people who've chosen to come to Israel, a thriving economy, a democracy in a region where democracy has not taken hold, and a young generation that gives a lot of grounds for optimism. Those are some of the achievements, I would say, that we're marking this year and in recent years.
Great. I want to talk a little bit more about democracy in a bit, and we're getting some questions about that, but I was hoping you could talk about some of the key long-term changes underway in Israeli civil society. What are you observing?
Well, that's a very wide question. If you want, I'll go on democracy first, and then steer me wherever else you want to go.
Okay.
The first thing to say is that our democracy is something that we are insistent upon and very proud of. That is emphatically functioning, but that I would also say is being battered, and that takes us a little bit into politics. This is a country where 21% Arab minority, another 5% defined as other, and even much of the Jewish majority do not come from countries with a strong recent democratic tradition. I don't know the breakdown between Middle Eastern, North African Israeli Jews and European Israeli Jews, but there's a big proportion. So a lot of Israel has no historic tradition of democracy in the origins of much of its populace. And yet we insist on being a democracy, and we are a democracy. And before I get onto all the things that worry me, I would even say in the Arab sector, we've seen in the last two elections a recommitment and a joining, I would say, of the Israeli democracy. If you look at what had happened here 4 elections ago and 3 elections ago, you had a process really where the Arab minority seemed to believe that they were being marginalized and almost disenfranchised, and they kind of were accelerating that trend. And what happened between April 2019 and September 2019, when the Arab turnout went from 50% to 60%, was that the leadership of the Arab political sector, I suppose you'd say, first of all, they got together. The joint list was reconstituted as one party in September. They'd run on 2 lists in April. And they basically said, that they felt with some reason that the prime minister and others on the Israeli right were trying to marginalize their constituency. And their leadership said, let's not let this happen. If we vote, we can have an impact. And the seats of the joint list, however you calculate them, went really from 10 in April last year to 13, I think, in September, and 15 now, and a higher and a participation rate in the elections only slightly lower than the national turnout. So that's a recommitment to democracy by Israel's Arab minority. At the same time, and running counter to that, you've got a prime minister who's been indicted in 3 criminal cases, and who originally, when he was being investigated, alleged that the opposition was somehow illicitly trying to force him from power, and that the media, the left-wing media, was joining the left-wing opposition in trying to oust him. And then, as the investigation proceeded, began alleging that the police were biased against him and were part of this effort. And finally, when he was indicted, alleged that the state prosecution, all the way up to the Attorney General, was now engaged in an attempted political coup. Now, his trial was meant to start a little over a month ago. It was postponed, as was much court activity in Israel and elsewhere because of the virus. It's now due to start very early next month, a couple of weeks from now. And as far as we know, it will go ahead. But the way he has sought to brand the nature of what's been going on is a battering of the hierarchies of law enforcement. There's also, in part of the agenda of the Israeli right, a concern that Israel's High Court, its Supreme Court, is too liberal and too interventionist. And there's been a lot of talk of trying to rein in the powers of the Supreme Court. We had, just a month ago, we had the Knesset Speaker, somebody who was, I think, widely seen as a man of democracy, Yuli Edelstein, defied the High Court, rejected, ignored a court order to hold a vote on his job. He was the speaker in the last parliament. We'd had elections. He was now the acting speaker, and he was not putting his job up for a vote. And the court told him he had to, and he resigned and closed down parliament rather than do that. So there are some efforts to rein in and discredit, and in some cases defy the court. Now, Netanyahu, if the court intervenes now, and as I mentioned before, there are petitions to the court against the coalition deal that's taking shape. And there are petitions to the court against Netanyahu being allowed, as a politician under indictment, to set up another government as prime minister. In the coalition deal, there is provision: if the court intervenes and prevents Netanyahu from being prime minister, we'll have new elections. That's actually specified in the next 6 months. If the court intervenes, we'll have new elections. I imagine if Netanyahu is prevented from being prime minister, his election campaign will focus to some extent on the unacceptable, I'm putting words in his mouth here, but I think this is what he would say, intervention in the will of the people, preventing him from being prime minister. So again, you would have, at the very least, I mean, some people might say that part of what I've said is actually strengthening Israeli democracy and rebalancing something that has become skewed. And that's certainly what Netanyahu would argue. He would say, I'm protecting democracy against an overly interventionist Supreme Court that is not elected. Our balance has been a little bit off. And you people on this call, you make your own judgments. I would add, some of what I've said just now is pretty critical of Netanyahu. We'll get to, I'm sure, other aspects of his premiership. I have a lot of praise for Netanyahu. I think that Israel has come through a very difficult period in terms of its security. This is a toxic, dangerous region. It's an unpredictable region. And Netanyahu has kept Israel relatively safe. And as the father of 3 kids who've all finished their army service, 2 of whom were in combat units, the 3rd of whom was in an intelligence unit, when Israelis go to the polls, uppermost in mind is who's keeping their kids safest during those army years. Is there another politician who would do a better job of keeping the country safe? It's one of the reasons why Benny Gantz mounted an effective challenge to Netanyahu until his turnaround to join Netanyahu in the last few weeks, because he and his party had security credentials too. So when I'm expressing concern about Netanyahu battering the hierarchies of democracy in Israel, it's not the concern of someone who thinks that Netanyahu is just a disaster for Israel in every sense of the word. I really don't think that. I worry that other leaders would have done far less effective jobs in keeping this country safe through very, very difficult years. It's respect for Netanyahu as someone who has kept Israel safe, as someone who can articulate Israel's concerns, who has been able to build important relations for Israel with world leaders, who I think realized very early how dangerous this pandemic was, who I don't think you can easily say overreacted when you look at some of the comparisons that I drew, but who I also am concerned has been in the cause of his own legal entanglements, been a factor in seeking to discredit some of the essential hierarchies of Israeli democracy.
Great. I want to ask about the U.S.-Israel relationship with respect to the upcoming U.S. Elections. We have a question from Howard Weiser. What are your views on the stakes for Israel in the upcoming U.S. elections, both presidential and congressional?
Okay, so first of all, people on this call will be more expert than I am on the domestic side of what's happening in America. We are, the people whose business it is to know, I think, are very acutely aware of everything that plays out in America. Most Israelis are aware, albeit maybe at a less profound and immersive level, of the stakes. Nonetheless, this relationship is crucial to us. I would say existentially crucial, the US-Israel relationship, in terms of, I think it's reciprocally very important. We are on the front lines in a region against enemies who are, in some cases, very hostile to Israel and no less hostile to the United States. We're just the little Satan. You guys are the big Satan. The military innovation, defensive and offensive, the sharing of intelligence, the people-to-people contacts between Israel and the United States are essential, I would say, at the most basic level of keeping both countries secure. And then, of course, the fact that we are allied and we feel are rightly, widely supported by an ally. That is the world's leading superpower. It's very important to us. And we are always concerned that that relationship remain firm. I think the pillars of the relationship are strong. They relate not only to common values, but also to common interests. And I think as long as all of that is the case, those pillars are strong. And we have ups and downs. We have ups and downs that are not, and it's important to say, on a call like this with an audience like this, they're not ups and downs that you can easily categorize as, this political party in Israel, when it's in power, doesn't get on so well with that political party in America when they're in power. It really doesn't work like that. And you don't have to look back very far to appreciate the truth of what I'm saying. Israelis, to be incredibly crude here, didn't adore Barack Obama and loved Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton moves to Israel, converts to Judaism, we'd elect him to, pretty much any office in the land, I would say. And comment to that, look again, very warmly disposed, I would say, to George Bush Jr., much less so to George Bush Sr., whether it was Likud in power or a Labour-oriented government in some of those years. Some of the factors there are, of course, they're policy related, but there are also factors involving empathy. Does this administration or that president convey to Israelis a sense of empathy? We're an emotional people. And Obama was never more popular than the day he came to Israel, whipped off his jacket, strolled around Ben Gurion Airport in his shirt sleeves alongside Netanyahu, went to see an Iron Dome battery. But it was the casual ease and the conveyance of friendship that resonated, by the way, resonated around the world, resonated with Israel. Why do we like Bush Jr.? Because of the sense of empathy and gut support for us. And that's one of the reasons why, look at the run up to your last election. We were polled in Israel. Who did we want to get elected in America, right? Every poll that I saw, everyone, was 10 to 20% Israelis. If we'd have voted for Hillary Clinton. But in some of those polls, we were also asked, who do we think would be better for Israel? And in those polls, Israelis said Trump. Now that just doesn't make any sense, right? Why would you, if you'd have had the vote, which we don't, you'd have chosen the president who you thought would be less good for Israel than the one you wouldn't have voted for. And the only way to explain that is a collection of empathy, gut instinct, and most of all, dependability. I think when Israelis were not voting in your elections last time, we didn't know about Trump. And Israelis have all the range of emotions where Trump is concerned that Americans do, with the added dimension that pretty much consensually, I would say, there's appreciation among Jewish Israelis for Trump recognizing Jerusalem as our capital, for Trump basically underlining, confirming Israel's extension of sovereignty to the Golan Heights. There were concerns in Israel about America pulling troops out of Syria, which would embolden Russia. There are concerns in Israel about America, a general trend maybe that predates Trump, less engaged overseas, more isolationist overseas. These are concerns for us. We need an engaged America. We think it's good for America as well. God forbid, we don't want American lives lost in our defense, but an America that is not, a friend of mine, who some of you may know, called Tal Becker, or an Israeli strategist, lawyer, wise man, always talks about Israel, always talks about the Middle East as the dinner guest that won't go home. You turn your back on the Middle East, it bites you. And therefore, we feel in Israel, a more engaged America is good for America and good for Israel. A less engaged America means an emboldened Russia. And although we have interesting and often very good relationships with Russia, Russia's allies are some of our enemies, notably including the Syrians and the Iranians, of course. So all of that is at stake to some extent whenever there are shifts in America, even in non-national races, but in national races as well, and of course with the presidency. When you look at the two candidates from a strictly Israel point of view, I think Israelis would say clearly you have two candidates who are supportive of Israel, who you would now say dependably supportive, in as much as anything in this insane world is dependable. And then you have, something that we haven't talked about yet, and I assume you'd want to talk about. We certainly do have differences when it comes to the degree of leeway that an American administration might give or might try to impose or give Israel when it comes to policies on the Palestinians and maybe on the Iranians. And I know this is a very long answer, but I think it's really important. So on Iran, I don't want to say it doesn't matter what America thinks, because that's not true. But if ultimately Israel thought that it was in mortal peril, it would do whatever it thought it had to do to protect itself against Iran. And it would go down less well or more well, as the strike on Osirak almost 40 years ago. We were criticized by the Reagan administration formally, and I think Reagan said privately, "Oh well, boys will be boys." And I think Cheney had a photograph of Israel's strike on the Osirak reactor on the wall of his office. But overtly, at least, it was not appreciated by the United States. Israel did what it felt it had to do. Where the Palestinians are concerned, I think there's much more nuance and much more potential leverage and influence and back and forth. At the moment, you have an administration that seems to be signaling that if Netanyahu wants to extend Israeli sovereignty to annex, it amounts to the same thing, to all the Israeli settlements, and to maybe another 20, that's maybe 3% of the territory in the West Bank, depending on how you define it, maybe on another 25, 30% of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley. The signal from the administration, and it's not completely clear, is that you can go ahead and do that. Maybe only once the government is sworn in, if it's sworn in, and once the mapping of the areas is complete, and that was delayed because of the virus. There are some mixed signals. Netanyahu thought he was able to do that as soon as the Trump peace to prosperity vision was unveiled, and then Jared Kushner kind of said, no, there has to be a government first, and we have to complete the mapping. It's clear from what Joe Biden's camp is saying that there would be a much more cautious approach. There would be a desire for any Israeli extension of sovereignty to be in the context of negotiations with the Palestinians. And as I say, it's not entirely clear what the administration is saying. I've given you a fair summation, but it's a summation that is not entirely clear. And I think we're going to see how this plays out fairly soon. The only policy, and with this I'll end this answer, the only policy apart from fighting the virus that the Gantz-Netanyahu coalition has said it can move ahead on in its first 6 emergency months. In other words, the only major piece of legislation that they've agreed could move forward is annexation. Everything else, they either both have to agree on it or it doesn't happen. But annexation, Netanyahu, under the coalition deal from July 1st, can start to move ahead on annexation. He will do that in coordination with the Americans, who are signaling certainly more readiness than a Biden administration apparently would, or than an Obama administration, or even a Clinton administration would, for unilateral action.
Thanks, David. I want to stay on annexation for another minute because we have a lot of questions on this, and some of these questions you touched on, but maybe you can expand a little bit more. We have a question from Lisa Eisen. Assuming the government is established, what's your take on the annexation component of the government agreement? What do you see playing out in terms of annexation, and what will be the reverberations?
So, we're covering a lot of ground here, and that's good. And Israel has moved. There have been days in Israel where, between morning and evening, the narrative of where the country was heading has been remade. When Edelstein shuttered the Knesset, he closed down Parliament because he didn't want to do what the court was telling him to do. That was a pretty radical day. And then I think it was 2 days later, I think we're talking March the 24th and March the 26th, but it was certainly around those dates, we had, an absolute political revolution here. We had, and I promise you this is the beginning of an answer to the question, we had Benny Gantz, who'd been charged with the president with setting up a government because he had 61 of our 120 Knesset members recommending him as prime minister. He was the prime minister in waiting on March the 26th, I think it was. And he announced, actually, I'm not going to try and make a government. I'm going to get myself elected as Speaker of the Knesset, so I have some leverage over the agenda, but I'm going to enter negotiations with Netanyahu to let him be prime minister, even though the president told me that I have the mandate. And then, so basically, Gantz was breaking the first core goal of his return, of his entry to politics, and the whole purpose of his political alliance. Blue and White, which is now a much reduced party, the only common factor between the disparate elements of Blue and White was that they all wanted to get rid of Netanyahu. And Gantz said, well, actually, I've changed my mind. There's a virus, democracy's under threat. I'm going to partner with Netanyahu. That was part one of his volte-face. Now, he said he was doing this for the good of Israel, and it was an act of principle and an act of morality. And I think he means that. It was well-intentioned. I'm not even sure he thinks that Netanyahu will ever hand over power to him as he's supposed to in 18 months. But it was, to my mind, very naive tactically. And I have profound reservations about what he did in terms of the electorate's faith in its politicians. And, we know that politicians have been known to lie. But when your entire political agenda revolves around one imperative, which you say you're pursuing because you think the prime minister is not only allegedly corrupt and divisive, but you've been saying dangerous to Israel, I think it's quite the thing when you suddenly say, well, actually, things are so bad, virus-wise and democracy-wise, I'm putting all of that aside. I also think that they could have stayed in opposition for 6 months and supported the government in tackling the virus. The argument against that is that Netanyahu might have pushed elections. Well, okay, so Netanyahu could have pushed elections. That would have been his choice. But now to the second part of Gantz's shift, which brings us to the question, in joining forces with Netanyahu, in negotiating this deal, he put aside his principles where annexation is concerned. He had said, I think the Trump program is a good program as a basis for negotiation and cooperation with the other affected players. In other words, the Jordanians and the Palestinians and so on. As he thought, yes, Israel should be able to expand its sovereignty into parts of the West Bank, but it has to be done in a negotiated way, which may mean, by the way, that it couldn't be done. But that was his position. And under the terms of the deal, he can say that, he can still say that. He can vote against annexation, but he is part of a government that has not yet been approved, but he will be part of a government on an agenda he has approved where Netanyahu is able to raise annexation. It's not entirely clear that he can vote against, but he probably could vote against. But the votes would be there in the Knesset, if not in the government, to get legislation passed in as far as is needed to start annexing territory in the West Bank. That brings us to what Netanyahu might do. I don't know. To listen to Netanyahu, he would annex the area covered by the settlements. To listen to Netanyahu, he would annex the Jordan Valley. Will he do it right away? Will he do it from July the 1st? Is he prepared to risk the impact that would have on our relationships with Jordan for a start? Might Jordan suspend or cancel the 1994 peace treaty with us? These will be considerations that Netanyahu will be taking into account. He'll be pleasing the firm right-wing part of his constituency. Certainly part of the center-right and the center. I don't know how much. It would depend on how it goes down among the Palestinians. If it prompts massive violence, how would that be received? There were a lot of warnings of immense violence if Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital and if Trump moved the embassy. Well, there was a degree of violence. There were something like 60 people killed on the Gaza border. Almost all of them at that time, almost all of them members or affiliates with Hamas. And therefore, relatively speaking, everything is relative. Not a huge surge or protracted surge of violence, not a third intifada. So that would be, there would be gauging of the consequences of that. Among the other consequences, depending on how much is annexed, does that mean the death of a potential two-state solution? Is there no viable contiguous territory for any kind of Palestinian entity, something like a state. I mean, you guys can look at the maps and make your own decisions. One of the most relevant considerations, if you do look at the map, are about 15 what are called, I think they're called enclaves, community enclaves, enclave communities, settlements that would be really inside territory that is designated for a Palestinian entity, where securing those settlements will be very, very complicated. How are you able to do that and keep any kind of potential relationship with the Palestinians available? These are the kinds of considerations. And if I'm not giving you kind of a definitive on July the 1st, Netanyahu will annex A, B, C, D, it's because he hasn't spelled that out, but he has made clear a desire to indeed annex all the settlements and the Jordan Valley. And Gantz, in this deal, gives him the government tools to do so. And it seems like the administration would not intervene to prevent it. But that last one, again, I just add that caveat, that's what Netanyahu thought was the case not so many weeks ago, and it turned out to not quite be the case. And even this week, even the last comments from the State Department of the last couple of days, you can annex, but we want you to negotiate with the Palestinians. What, but one before the other, at the same time, conditional, not entirely clear to me.
Thanks, David. I wanted to ask a question from our board co-chair, Todd Richmond. He asks about the northern border. Can you give us an update on the northern border? We've seen some political unrest in Lebanon and, of course, the threat of Hezbollah there.
Yeah, so even in the time of pandemic, bad things still happen. Hezbollah is still transporting arms. Israel is still, I think I have to say, reportedly operating in Syria. We've certainly acknowledged operating in Syria, but I'm not sure in the latest couple of strikes, I'm not sure that Israel's taken responsibility, is widely said to have targeted a Hezbollah vehicle, among other things that we're doing. Our defense minister, Naftali Bennett, has made clear that we continue to act against Iran's efforts to establish itself militarily in Syria and to convey military hardware to Hezbollah and so on. So all of that is as fraught as it always is. I think Israel has been somewhat successful in preventing some of Iran's goals in terms of the degree to which they are set up to attack us from Syria. It's a very, very complicated reality there because Russia is so dominant. And we, as you know, have had cases where, a Syrian anti-aircraft fire knocked a Russian reconnaissance plane out of the air, killed 15 people not too many months ago. And Moscow was very, very angry with Israel. The Moscow defense establishment, Putin was milder, but obviously had people at home saying this is outrageous. And he himself did not say it was outrageous. He recognized that it was a very unfortunate series of events. It was not Israel that shot down the plane and so on. But it's a very complicated relationship there. We're trying to stop Iran. We've tried to convey to Russia that we don't think it's in anybody's interest for Iran to be potent on that side of the border. We've had incidents that have probably been forgotten that could have made for a very different reality right now. There were a couple of missiles that were fired from Syria last year, I think I'm right in saying, that landed in the Kinneret, when, unlike today, when there's nobody at the Kinneret, which is radical on Yom HaTzmaut, there were loads of Israelis on the banks of the Kinneret. A couple of missiles, splashed down into the water. A few dozen meters in a different direction, there would have been a very different result. And everything that's played out in the last, in the period since, might have been very different. So, you have immense potential tension on the Syrian border, on the Lebanese border. You have a Lebanon preoccupied with several other factors as well, and a Hezbollah that has been somewhat discredited inside Lebanon. There are protests. Hezbollah has kind of tried to rebrand itself in the last few weeks as that force that is helping to fight the virus. And other people in Lebanon are branding Hezbollah that force that helped bring in the virus because of people coming from Iran. So it's not only focused on Israel. And by the way, since we're looking at a little at the region, we talked a bit about Jordan. There are all kinds of other interesting and strange things going on in Egypt, which is broadly supportive of Israel at the government level. There's been a pretty nasty television show predicting Israel's destruction and the falling apart of the United States. Read about that if you didn't catch that piece. We had a piece on it. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, there have been a couple of TV dramas going out, not Saudi state dramas, but they wouldn't be being broadcast if the royal family wasn't allowing it. A couple of dramas that are almost, philo-Jewish. One drama where there's like a Hebrew monologue, another drama where a character talks about the benefits of improved ties with Israel. So yeah, there's lots of things to continue to be concerned about and to keep up one's guard about. At the same time that the common interest in facing down Iran continue to provide some apparent warming of ties in some areas.
Thanks, David. I want to be mindful of the time, so I'll try to get 2 more questions in, if that's all right with you. This question's from Stuart Gershon. With the demise of the Labor Party, as you've written, what will it take to resurrect an Israeli center from the dead? Why doesn't Lapid do better politically?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if you have loads of questions. I'll try and answer more briefly because so I'll try and do that. Okay. Lapid was doing pretty well. Lapid a month ago, a little over a month ago, thought that he was a member of a party that had a chance at forming Israel's next government, and at the very least was challenging pretty effectively because Gantz and Moshe Ya'alon had given his Yesh Atid additional security credibility, which he never had. And then Gantz did for Lapid, terrible, evil, unthinkable, biggest fraud in Israeli history, I think Lapid called it. And we've had some frauds in Israeli history. Maybe he meant the biggest political fraud. We've even had some of those, but he was doing fairly well and he will now try and rebuild. But the Israeli center has been very badly damaged and discredited by what Gantz did. And it will be interesting to see where some of those votes that came to Blue and White now go, with Blue and White joining the coalition and its former allies in Yesh Atid and Telem. I know this is hard to keep track of, now back apart. And they're not even all center-left either, because of course the Telem part of Lapid and Ya'alon's party is first of all reduced, and Moshe Ya'alon is no center-leftist, he's a political hawk. And Labour, as your questioner rightly says, doesn't really exist anymore. It won 3 seats as an alliance in the elections just now. 2 of them are now joining the coalition. Merav Michaeli is left alone, having lost the battle in the Labour Central Committee to not join the coalition. I don't even know what she's going to do. And I don't know what happens to them. And therefore, we're in a process now of regrouping on the Zionist center and left, with part of its electorate, I think, very disillusioned and feeling betrayed by Gantz. It will be a long, long road back. I don't think anything is forever. A context in which it would have a better time would be if more Israelis were more confident that we could reach some kind of accommodations with the Palestinians. And there you get into all the nuance and complexity of Mahmoud Abbas, who is not Arafat in that he's not deliberately orchestrating terrorism, who is inciting against Israel and who makes some terrible speeches and has not given the Israeli center a great new sense of faith in the viability of the partnership. I mean, Meretz believes we can negotiate a deal with Abbas. I think Labour might have said that was possible, but I don't even know what we can define Labour as anymore. It would be in a climate in which Israelis were more optimistic about the prospects of peacemaking, then the center, in whatever designation, gets bolstered.
Thanks, David. Final question for me, and then I'm going to hand it back to Mark to close. 2048, Israel will be 100. And how do you think the country will be different then?
Yeah, okay. Really, I honestly, I cannot tell you what's going to happen tonight. I know that the closure is over, I think in maybe an hour or 2. That I can tell you, I think. I think we're going to be allowed to go out. 2048, they tell us there'll be 15 million Israelis. That's 50% more than we are today. I don't know on what basis they made that prediction, but they made that prediction on the eve of Independence Day. A lot of what I've said first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to hopefully bring some nuance and some sense of perspective. A lot of it is grounds for confidence and optimism, and some of it is grounds for concern. Short term, I'm not, I mean, we're in the middle of a blooming pandemic with political deadlock, lots of nasty people and around us, and all sorts of concerns about the near term. In the medium and long term, I am an optimist, hard that might be to believe. I think the essential character of this country is amazing. I think the people of this country are amazing. Things like their resilience and their mutual concern and sense of common interest, that if we ultimately don't act on each other's behalf, we will be so vulnerable. Now, we've been to the brink. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin was a brink for Israel. And we've pulled back from that. And we have very bitter internal disagreements. But I'd like to think that we're maturing as a nation, and we're recognizing increasingly how much we have to gain by holding together and acting sensibly and finely on everybody else's behalf. And I say that, you know, I'm going to give you a bit of a sort of wider answer because it's important to me. You know, I think we're living in an era where people often are increasingly intolerant and often are. I just look at some of the comments that go up on articles on our website. There seems to be, and that's after we've tried to marginalize some of the more, or ban some of the more reprehensible commenters. There seems to be a great deal of anger and a lack of nuance and growing intolerance in many places, and Israel's not immune. But I just hope that I'm right. I hope I'm right about Israel, and I hope I'm right about. I hope I'm right for the rest of the world. One of the great core principles of Judaism is, you know, treat other people the way you would want to be treated. Those are the kinds of core principles that go to the reason why it's kind of wonderful that this religion and this nation has survived. Maybe they explain partly how this religion and this nation has survived through the millennia. And I think ultimately everything that is good in Israel will triumph over all kinds of real challenges and divisive internal issues. So I'm optimistic. Fantastic people here, often better than their leaderships, often deserving, I would say, better than their leaderships give them. But an incredible country. And how old am I going to be in 2048? Yeah, I suspect I might not be around to make this call, but if I am, doddering in my armchair, I hope that I'll be able to confirm that in a conversation with you guys in 2048.
We like that. Thanks so much, David. We're delighted to have you here and really honored. I'm going to hand it back off to Mark Melman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel, for great moderating. Thank you, David, for an extraordinarily insightful presentation. We really appreciate it very much. I urge people, if you haven't already become a regular viewer of Times of Israel, to please do so. It's an excellent, really superb resource on the internet for all of us. I do want you to know that Democratic Majority for Israel continues its work despite the pandemic, despite the fact that we're all working from home. We are facing some extraordinarily important battles coming up. We will have a significant battle, it seems, over the Democratic National Platform, something we're very engaged in at the moment. We're engaged in battles over platforms for Democratic state parties around the country. Just in recent days, we won a victory in Arizona, removing some anti-Israel planks there. And literally just yesterday, the day before yesterday, we won a significant battle in Nevada, having some anti-Israel planks removed from the Nevada State Democratic Platform. So this work continues day in, day out. Our sister organization, DMFI PAC, just helped two members of Congress win their elections last night in Ohio and in Maryland, two pro-Israel champions who defeated anti-Israel challengers. Again, this is another part of the work that the DMFI PAC, our sister organization, is undertaking. So be assured we are hard at work to continue pursuing our mission, which is to make sure the Democratic Party remains a pro-Israel party, as it is traditionally and historically been. Want to wish you all a Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach, a happy Independence Day to all of you, and look forward to seeing you on a future call. Thank you very much for participating. And again, David, thank you so very much. And Rachel, thank you as well.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.